Hi, Auntie Pam. We have one message. We welcome you all to our Sunday afternoon series at the Dartmouth Historical and Arts Society. This is unlike our usual meetings when we're at the schoolhouse. We're doing this as a virtual meeting, and we welcome all of you, all the members and friends. And our speaker tonight is the Reverend Pamela Cole, who is going to continue educating us about the history of religion in Old Dartmouth area. And tonight she'll be talking about the Second Great Awakening, that period of religious revival, and some of the events that happened that were significant in the history of the town during that period. Pam has been a very loyal and successful member of our group, has made several previous presentations, has served as pastor in local congregations of the Friends Society, as well as Congregational Church in Smith Mills, and done many other volunteer works in the field of religion in our area. She's going to be speaking tonight, as I said, about the Second Great Awakening, and she has a slideshow to present to us. I thank you all for joining us with this new technology. This is a shakedown cruise, and I congratulate all of you for having the courage to engage in something new. Even though we're talking about history, we're using the newest technology to reach our fan base, and we welcome you here. And I'll turn it over now to Pam Cole.
Well, it's so good to see everybody. And I did want to mention what we did in the first 3 sessions. We're now tonight on the 4th. So we did everything before the 1700s was our first one. And our second one was the 1700s to the 1800s. And the third one was just at the end of the 1700s when our country was started. We talked about some of the people that helped to get the First Amendment of separation between church and state into the Bill of Rights, and how some of them, we mentioned some of the people like Pastor Bacchus of Middleborough that helped to get that into the Bill of Rights. And so we didn't really get too many years done. So we really, even though we've done 3, we've really only done 2 centuries. So now we're starting on our 3rd century, called New Bedford in the Second Great Awakening. Now, remember that Old Dartmouth, and we hear this over and over, but just as a review, Old Dartmouth was different from most of the other towns in Massachusetts because of this was where the Quakers had settled and had many Quaker meeting houses, and most of the other towns had one meeting house in the center of the common. The Congregational State Church was what other people had at that time, and some Baptist churches had started in other parts of Massachusetts. But we had, at the end of the 1700s, we had the Congregational churches, the precinct churches at the downtown New Bedford Harbor, and in the Bear Haven, and up at the head of the river in what became Acushnet. And we had the Baptists that were in Tiverton and were just beginning to get started in downtown New Bedford. And then we also had the Quakers, so that we sort of had a braid of 3 different kinds of Christians. And then we added in the new kind right at the end of the 1700s, which were called the Christians. And they were really part of the forerunner and a major player in the Second Great Awakening. So we, as Old Dartmouth, we actually had a large part in the whole of the Christian group, and I will talk about that in a little bit. So that when we talk about the Second Great Awakening, we can even say that besides Old Dartmouth adding to the Quaker faith all over and all over the country, as we talk about the removals and the people that left from here, went to New York and went to Ohio as Quakers. We also had a role to play in what was called the Christians. And of course, you and I look at each other and say, well, most of the people that are on this Zoom tonight would identify themselves as Christians. So what is different? So we'll talk about that. So I want to start tonight by just quickly showing all of the Quaker meeting houses, most of which were there as we start the New Bedford in the Second Great Awakening, which we will put a date on it from 1800 to about 1835. So we only can do maybe 1/3 of the 1800s tonight. That's how much faith and how much diversity there was in the faith of New Bedford, that we're not even going to come close to scratching the surface of what New Bedford religion was like in the first 35 years of the 1800s. And that's why I picked the topic, the Second Great Awakening, so we can just focus on that and I won't get off the track, let's hope. So here we go. These are the churches, the Quaker churches that we know were there. And these meeting houses date back to just about the 1800s. Now, bear with me, I'm gonna have to remember. Dan's taught me how to do this, but we gotta see if I can do it now. Success. So there is an old picture of the Apponeganset Meeting House and one privy. And here is Allen's Neck on the left, which was built in the 1700s, and Smith Neck, which was built in the early 1800s. So people didn't have to walk all the way to Apponeganset, and they could worship in their own neighborhoods. And here it was the Westport meeting. And this is a newspaper photo, and you can see that it still had, now I bet you I don't have a pointer, do I? But if you look in the left part of the picture, you could see the carriage sheds were still there in this meeting house. This meeting house was built at the end of the 1700s and significantly redone, led by the chairman of the property committee, who was Paul Cuffey, the famous African-American merchantman, most famous African-American, I'd say, of the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so this is what the meeting house was. He was on the committee in 1813. Then there was a Long Plain meeting house, and I put this one in. There's lots of different pictures of it, and you can go see it today, but those are the carriage sheds. And I think they're hoping to rebuild the carriage sheds so that it will really look authentic. And you know, there's that wonderful, beautiful lawn there.
Got it.
Somebody say something about Long Plain? Okay. Then downtown was the New Bedford meeting, and the the new brick meeting house was finished in 1822, and at the time it was the biggest Quaker meeting house in New England, and it is still a substantial building. So that gives us the background. Now we'll talk about the Second Great Awakening. So many times when we talk about young people and what young people get to learn about American history today, we know that some of the books leave out the faith of America and of Americans. And of course, to us, that's very important because it's the motivation and what gives us the drive and the creativity we feel is the inspiration that comes from God and from the Judeo-Christian tradition. So this is a textbook used at Stang High School and used at Bristol Agricultural County School for the American history textbook. And it does, whenever there was some major feature of American religion or faith that took place, it got logged in this American history book. So what I've done tonight is anytime you see red print, it's when I copy it straight out of the textbook. And then we'll show the pictures of New Bedford that actually illustrate the textbook. And it shows that just what the textbook is talking about happened in America did happen in New Bedford and Dartmouth and Fairhaven, Cushnet. So in the Second Great Awakening, now we're just finishing up the census. You know, it's really interesting that this should start with the 1790 census, which was the first of the decennial or every 10-year census. And we're right now trying to finish the 2020 census. And I took the day off work because I'm a census taker, and I took the day off work today so that I could prepare this for tonight. And the 1790 census showed that only about 1 out of 10 Americans was a member of a church. Yet in the early 1800s, the pressures of a changing society led many people to renew their religious faith. And a movement called the Second Great Awakening began among Protestants in the backcountry of Kentucky and Tennessee and attracted large numbers of people. And one of the things about it, it was what was called an evangelical movement. And this is the definition from the history textbook. A Christian religious movement is evangelical when it emphasizes 3 ideas. The scripture is the final authority. Salvation can only be achieved through a personal belief in Jesus Christ. And people demonstrate true faith by leading a transformed life and by performing good deeds. And this is sometimes called witnessing for Christ. Now, we know that at about that time, people of New England started this group called the Christians. And when it says here that a movement called the Second Great Awakening began among Protestants in the backcountry of Tennessee and Kentucky and attracted large numbers of people, Martin Stone was a big leader in that. But there were also people in New Jersey and people in New England that had the same ideas as the people in Kentucky all at the same time. And so they thought that God was with them, that in 3 parts of the new young country, they would all have these new ideas. So here in New England, this was called the Christians. And they didn't call themselves Congregationalists. They didn't call themselves Catholics. They didn't call themselves Anglican. They only took the name Christian so that all people that followed Christ could be together in one group. And that was like a new and novel idea. And it comes out of the idea of the evangelical movement that what distinguishes you as a Christian is your own personal relationship to God, and not a particular relationship that is negotiated by which religious organization you join. So late 18th century Christians at the end of the 1700s in New England was a separatist movement, just like the Pilgrims had separated from the Anglicans. Now the Christians are actually separating from all the different denominations and merging together. And it was a protest. The reason for separating from the larger denominations of the day are a protest against the harsh dogmatism of the creeds. Now, one of the reasons we didn't do the First Great Awakening when we were doing this at the beginning of the 1700s is that there were so many people that even though it was a wonderful idea that people in the early 1700s were, as you could say, coming back to God or coming home to God, the preaching was so dogmatic about the sinners and the wickedness and what would happen to you if you didn't come home to God, that it's not as interesting for us today. It is not as interesting to learn about the First Great Awakening. So in New England, and especially down here in Assonet and Freetown and North Dartmouth, they gathered the principles of the evangelical words that came out of the textbook. And what I gave you here in red is not out of the textbook, it's out of the bylaws of the Smith Mills Christian Congregational Church, because Smith Mills followed Hicksville in taking these new principles. The Lord Jesus Christ is the only head of the church, no bishops. The Holy Bible is our only rule of faith and practice. We don't read long tomes of theology from the Middle Ages. Christian is a sufficient name for Christ followers. Christian character of life is the only test of fellowship. And then individual interpretation is the right and privilege of all Christians, so that they believe that a Christian could pick up the Bible and read it, and the Holy Spirit would help them to understand it, even in some of the difficult parts. And later on to these principles were added The union of all the followers of Christ is fundamental, that they shall all be one, even as Christ prayed. And that's important, but it was not one of the first 5 principles. So here is a picture of Smith Mills Christian Church as it looked in 1837, and it was one of the first churches in this new group of Christians to start a Sunday school, and probably therefore one of the first churches in the United States to start a Sunday school. Now downtown, they built a cute little church called First Christian on the end of Middle Street. Now that's right, almost where the Octopus is now. If you come up around the Octopus and you come behind the post office, that's where North 6th Street intersects with Middle Street. And so what we're doing is we're looking up North 6th Street, and if we were looking from right to left on the steps of the church, we would be looking at Middle Street. And that's taken down now. And as you come across the bridge was changed, and it was changed so that when you come up across the bridge, you could take that big circle at the Octopus, and you would have crashed into the back of the church if they hadn't taken the church down. But it was a lovely little church, and that was built in 1807. And then it wasn't nearly big enough for those people that thought this was such a great new kind of faith, that it was so much more free, so much more democratic. They built this huge church, and the steeple is 185 feet high, the same as St. Anthony's, but it was all made out of wood. This was before they invented steel. So it was much harder for them to maintain over the years to keep this steeple going the way now today St. Anthony's steeple has stood for more than 100 years. And of course, they're working on it right now. As I went by it yesterday, and they've got a scaffold up on. So this was a huge church, bigger than the Zeiterion. It was the biggest until St. Anthony's was built. I think it was the biggest auditorium in the city, so that oftentimes they had to have civic meetings there when they wanted to have a great many people there. But this was one of the churches that had these new principles that you should only call yourself a Christian. Then here's a couple more of them. If you're coming home Hicksbridge Road from Westport to Dartmouth, you go by a house that has been converted from the Westport Christian Church, to a private home now. So then it says that in addition to being evangelical, the textbook said, the Second Great Awakening was democratic, and anyone rich or poor could win salvation if he or she chose to do so. And the evangelical religions generally stress the importance of the congregation or the importance of the people rather than the ministers. So that pretty much summarizes the group of churches that were called Christian, that got started. And the first Christian actually started in 1807. Now, this is the inside of the beautiful North Christian Church. And you can see that the balconies, how they have managed to make the curve on the balcony that goes around. And so, that is beautiful woodworking. And there's a tiny hymn book stand. They had to make a special kind of hymn book stand that's up in the front by the pulpit. It's a piece of dark wood. But I now own that hymn book stand, and I've never seen one. They made it special for this platform. It rotates so that you can put 4 hymn books on each side of this little table, so that if you have 12 ministers up there or any speakers up there and they all need hymn books, you just spin the little table and grab your hymn book, and there'll be enough hymn books up on the platform for all the speakers. So that's really one of the most beautiful meeting houses we ever had in New Bedford, but they had to take it down in 1829 because they couldn't keep maintaining that very, very high spire. And this church was made by Russell Warren. So when you can read a book of all the wonderful things he did in the city, but it doesn't have this church in it, I don't think. But it's just, the pillars are just like what's called the Double Bank Building downtown. You know, the Double Bank Building on the end of William Street. So there was also another famous Christian church and it was called the Washington Street Meeting House. And it was where Captain William Whitfield brought Manjiro Nakahama after 2 other churches had asked that Manjiro be seated in the Negro pew. So you remember that Manjiro was the one that was shipwrecked on an island, and William Whitfield brought him home to Fairhaven, and he went through high school here. But they took him to at least one of the churches that I know about, and they asked that he not be seated with the family. He had to sit with the black members of the church. But that was not the way it was at a Christian church. The first Christian church, for example, that I showed you with the tall spire that was in downtown New Bedford, they have in their membership list Wampanoag Indians and Cape Verdeans that were members back in 1807. Excuse me, I need to take a little drink. So that church always had persons of color members, equal members. Now this one was built a little later, called Perry Hill Christian, but it's out on the road by Country Hardware that leads to Rochester, and it still has a Christian church. Now they use it for weddings. There's so many, it's so much easier. Of course, I could say this in February. It's so much easier to get to church. You don't need as many buildings now. But now, with the virus, we're not even using the buildings that we have. So here is another beautiful one that we've seen before in Russell's Mills. It's the Russell's Mills Christian Church that was across the street, right across the street from the Historical Society. And here's the beautiful one at North Westport. And this one had Wampanoag members who were deeded pews. When people brought their pews, so many pews were given to the Wampanoags as their own pews. And you got a deed to those pews, and you own like 6 feet by 3 feet of the meeting house when you owned your pew. And then, of course, the Mattapoisett Christian Church is still there, and it houses the Mattapoisett Historical Society. Now, the textbook goes on from saying that there's this new evangelical kind of approach to things by saying specific denominations. Now, the textbook says the United States soon had more different Christian denominations than any other nations. And the Baptists, they got their belief from their name from their beliefs about baptism, a Christian ceremony by which a person is made a member of the church. Unlike other denominations which tended to baptize people as infants, Baptists believe that only those who were old enough to understand Christian beliefs should be baptized, and Baptists baptized by immersion or dipping people completely underwater. Now, here was the first Baptist church. This building isn't quite that old, but we knew that this was here since 1685. And so it was another 100 years before the Second Great Awakening came. In the Second Great Awakening, there were so many people, as the textbook is saying, that were concerned about the difficulties of life at the beginning of the 1800s, that they all, the new spirit was awakened within them, the Spirit of God and Christ. And so many people turned to God. But in downtown New Bedford, about 1819, I think, they built the First Baptist Church building downtown, and that has been now turned into a playhouse, and they're going to have their first play in a couple of weeks, and it's going to be out on the lawn in the front. And so I think that you might want to find, they're hoping it'll be still warm enough for us to go and have the play there, because we have to distance ourselves, of course. But the church building itself has been changed into a theater for your theater, and the little Christian Ed building over on the side will remain the church We'll have a new chapel downstairs and still Sunday school rooms upstairs. What I wanted to tell you about the the First Baptist Church is that when they say that you don't get baptized until you're old enough to understand some of the basic tenets of the faith, I have found in the first book of records in the First Baptist Church when Polly Johnson was baptized. Now, Polly Johnson was the caterer and landlady for Frederick Douglass when he escaped from slavery and moved to New Bedford. So we find that she used to walk up from where she lived just below on 7th Street. She'd just walk up a few blocks and go to the First Baptist Church. And so it says the Lord's Day, April 30th, 1820, were baptized James Conwell and Polly Johnson of color, and then added to the church by John Pickens, the clerk. So here we have a really nice memento of this kind of baptism that's explained for us in this textbook. Now think how nice it would be for high school students that were studying high school to be able to have in their town all these examples of what their own textbook is talking about. So here then it says, by 1850, Baptists were the nation's second largest denomination, and I'll leave it to you to think what was the first largest denomination. And then it says American Baptists also spread their beliefs to other countries through foreign missionaries. So here is a picture of Adoniram and Ann Judson, who with a couple of other missionaries were the first to lead this country, and that's them going out of Salem Harbor. And Adoniram and Ann Hasseltine Judson from Malden, Massachusetts, reached India in 1812, and in 1813, Burma. They began writing and translating spiritual writings into Burmese language. And Adoniram was given a printing press there, so he wrote and asked for reinforcements to come out and help Ann and himself, and he wanted a printer especially. So on October 15th, 1816, the Reverend Mr. Howe and family landed at Rangoon, Burma, and Mr. Howe immediately began printing, and he printed 1,000 copies of the first tract that Judson had written on Christianity and 3,000 copies of a catechism written by Ann. Well, how do you think that George and his family got to Burma? Here is the first page of the history of the First Baptist Church of New Bedford, and that is now out on the web, so any of you can read it. Worldwide can read the history of the First Baptist Church of New Bedford, and it has a little paragraph in there that hasn't made it into Wikipedia yet, and it is that between the other ministries of Pastor Howe and between him going out to Burma to be a printer, help the missionaries and become a very hands-on missionary, he was the first pastor of the First Baptist Church of New Bedford. So this is what it says in the history book. And this first is a quote, right in handwriting by John Pickens, the same John Pickens who wrote down this was the day that Polly Johnson was baptized. It says, Lord's Day, April 24th, 1814, the foregoing request of the church being communicated to Elder Howe, he instantly accepted the invitation to be the first pastor. Reverend Howe's pastorate was very short, says the history of First Baptist. He was satisfactory to the members, but he had made a prior commitment to become a missionary in India, where he soon became associated with Luther Rice and the famous missionary Adoniram Judson. A printer by trade, he assisted Dr. Judson by printing portions of the Gospels and tracts which Dr. Judson had translated into the Burmese language. And that's what it says right here in the First Baptist Church's history. And now that it's out on the web, people studying missions in colleges around the world can know this extra tidbit of Reverend Howe's life that really never made it into any biographies that I've been able to find. But what I did read to you just before that and showed you the picture of the ship. That I found that information in a book that my great-grandfather left me, called The Life of Adoniram Judson by his son, Edward Judson. So I was very pleased to find that I owned a first edition of a book that tells about Reverend Howe going to Burma. All right, now here's another Baptist church that has been taken down, but there was we found the place during the bicentennial, and we were also able to find a sketch of what it looked like. It was on a corner, and of course now the property is, I believe, a house is there. So that is pretty much the end of the Baptist, and we go to another new denomination that was started at the same time, another New American denomination. It did have some roots in Britain. Methodists grew out of the beliefs of a British minister, John Wesley, who lived from 1703 to 1791. And this is it. By 1850, the Methodists had become the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And there's a picture of John Wesley, who never made it to New Bedford. The textbook says some of the reasons Methodism grew were it focused on a person's personal relations with God rather than religious doctrines that might be hard to understand. And also, the ministers had not necessarily all gone to Harvard. Methodist preachers had more in common with their congregations. They tended to understand the needs of the people. And also, Methodists spread their message through a system of traveling ministers called circuit riders. They traveled on horseback in sweeping routes or circuits through the wilderness and won many new members. And here we have a picture, a sketch of a circuit rider who came to New Bedford in 1795. So when we think about circuit riders and we see in the Westerns of the evangelists that go out and preach in these Western towns and try to minister to the cowboys and to the villains in the Western towns, we have to remember that our roads weren't any better. We didn't even have roads in New Bedford that you could put two horses abreast and drive a coach through, because at that time they still didn't really have the technology of a beautiful coach developed. So people were still riding one horse at a time. And the trees on County Street had all overgrown, all the leaves, and because the head of the rider was what kept hitting the leaves. So we send out trucks. If a 10-wheeler goes over a street enough times, it will make a curve on the shade trees over the top of the road. But when it was just a rider, the leaves would all grow out, and so the streets would be overgrown because there wasn't anything to keep them widening. So here is Jesse Lee, who came to New Bedford on a single horse in 1795, and he preached in New Bedford. Well, after that, not the Methodists didn't take hold. They didn't build any buildings or have any big groups then. And so you have to remember also the name of the second minister that was sent here, because Jesse Lee did this as a circuit rider. So he came and he went down to the vineyard, I believe, but he did not stay. But in 1807, so this is a very important date. In 1807, they started the first Christian church of New Bedford, the tall one that was called the White Church with the tall spire. But in 1807, this new revival, the Second Great Awakening, was to the point that the Christians weren't enough. They also had to have Methodists. And here is this town seal of the town of Acushnet with the red building on the right by the bridge that goes over the river. And in that building, the first pastor of the Methodists had his congregation, Pastor Epaphras Kibbe. So the two names that are associated with the beginning of Methodism in New Bedford, the two people that came here to help, not the local people, but the two people that came to help were Lee and Epaphras Kibbe. Now, remember what was happening to the Congregationalists. So many of them that went to the old precinct church had moved downtown, that they had a meeting house downtown, or they had moved downtown down the other side of the river to Fairhaven, and they had that beautiful meeting house there. So that meant that the old precinct meeting house was, which had been built in 1744, but it was really a nice meeting house. It was also used for the town meetings. That was vacant. So the Methodists rented this from, or used it from the Congregationalists. So they didn't build a new church for themselves right away. So this was land that had been given by the Jenny family and used since about the beginning of the 1700s. But now in 1744, well, no, about 1800, it started to be used for the Methodists. Now, this is the picture of the beautiful Methodist church that was built right on Tarkin Hill Road. And of course, if you think of it now, you know that church is not there, and that's because it was burned early in the 1900s. So they built the church now where everybody brought a big rock. It's called pasture rock. You pick up a nice big rock from the pasture of your farm and you bring it to the church, and they built it out of rocks, not out of brick, but they still feel that that would keep it from burning again. I don't have too many pictures of the Methodists in here tonight, but here's another one that's interesting. This was Center Methodist in Fairhaven, and we know that the church still has those beautiful pillars, but it burned in 1947, and so the lovely spire that was on the top, the tower that was on the top, and you could just barely see it through the trees, that came off, and they put a replacement tower on, but it, in my opinion, it was never as stately as the one that had been there before the fire. Then the textbook finishes up the Methodists and goes on to the new denomination called the Unitarians. And the textbook says the Unitarians believed that Jesus Christ, you can see some of my typos. It's because the print was too small while I was typing. I couldn't see my own mistakes. Unitarians believe that Jesus Christ was only a human messenger of God, not divine himself. And they saw God not as a stern judge, but as a loving father. And in 1825, Boston minister William Channing organized a conference of congregational ministers that became the American Unitarian Association. So what happened is that the Congregationalists, who were the descendants of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, now split into two groups. And actually, they were still both considered Congregationalists. There is still an association of congregational ministers that takes in all congregational ministers and all Unitarian ministers today. Because the meaning of congregational, of course, is a church in which the decisions and the governance and the calling of the pastor and the organizing of the Sunday school and everything is all planned by the Congregationalists, the congregation or the members. So that is the same in a Unitarian church or in a Trinitarian church. So the Congregationalists, as we know them and as we call them, remain Trinitarian, and the Unitarians believed in God, but that Jesus was really the Son of God and not really God himself. Now, how did that affect New Bedford? Well, we have seen this picture before. Let's see. You can still see it okay?
That's good.
See, I can't see it because I can only see the PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. The Bedford Village Church, that was the 3rd Precinct Church. When they moved the Congregational Church, the state church, the one that the government organized, they had one up at the head of the river called the Precinct Church, and I showed you the picture of the meeting house. they went down to Fairhaven and built this, and made a second precinct, sort of like parishes. And then they made one in New Bedford called the Third Precinct. And that one is on the corner of William Street and Purchase Street. And now that's where the big bank that we called the Merchants Bank was. It's a stone building today. But in 1795, it was this nice wooden building. And that is where all the Congregationalists in the downtown were going to church. But about the time of early part of 1800s, they had a disagreement among the pulpit committee that was choosing the new pastor. And part of the people on the pulpit committee wanted a person who had sort of the idea of the new Unitarian type of belief that was coming down from Boston, in which you did not believe that Jesus was truly God himself. This bothered some of the other Congregationalists. And I'd like to, and as you probably know, that in every town in New England, there was a kind of a vote at some point or other to decide whether they were going to remain with Trinitarian beliefs or whether they were going to remain, take this new idea of Unitarian beliefs. So what happened was, of course, everybody had given money in their offerings to build the meeting house, and a lot of the people had actually worked on it themselves. So the question became, if the majority of the people in the church wanted to leave and let the Unitarians stay in the original church, they would want the Unitarians to pay them their share of what the building would cost so they could build another building. And if the Congregationalists were the ones that believed in the Trinity wanted to stay and let the Unitarians go, then Unitarians thought that they should get a share of the money. So all of this went into the courts to try to decide who owned the building when they had these ideas. And you can tell that in different towns. You can't tell it in New Bedford because New Bedford had a little different kind of history. But you can tell it in the town that one of the towns I come from, which is the town of Lexington. Lexington has this beautiful white spire church with a very tall spire, and you can see it in pictures when you read about the Patriots' Day and April 19th. In the background, you always see this beautiful white church. But that's the Unitarian church. But if you go across the street, you see a church that's built out of pasture stone, just like the Acushnet Wesley Methodist is. So what you can conclude from that is that in that town, there were more Unitarians in the church than there were Trinitarians, and the Trinitarians left and had to build a new church so that their stone church is younger than the big old, what we call white New England meeting house. But there are other places where you go where the white tall spire church is a Congregational church and the Unitarians church is a more modern design. So, they're the ones that left. So I don't know if you know who left in New Bedford, but in New Bedford, who left were the Trinitarians. So basically the people who believed in the Unitarian approach stayed in this church. Now, next door to this church, and of course it's not there now, but you see where those houses are, that would be Purchase Street. And there's just a huge parking lot there now because when they took down, they thought they were going to, when they took down one of the churches, the New Bedford Economic Development people thought, oh, this is a good idea. We'll put in a new business. We'll take down this old church. We'll put in a new business. And of course, they've never come up with a business to replace the church. So it's still been a parking lot all these years. But where those houses are now, they built the Third Congregational Church. And so those two churches were side by side. And one of them was the Unitarians who remained in the church and got the new minister that they wanted. And next to it were the Congregationalists, and they named their church eventually. First, they called it the Calvinist Congregational Church, following the ideas of John Calvin. Then they called it I guess, the third congregational church. Finally, they called it the North Congregational Church. So it's a little confusing when you try to figure out the dates. Now, what was going on up north? Up north where the original church had been, the original Congregational Precinct Church had been, as we told you, that there were so many people moved downtown and were going to this meeting house downtown or in Fairhaven, that meeting house up there became vacant. They didn't have very many people to go. So the Congregationalists pretty much that were up there stopped going to church. But some of them moved, and they really weren't in the area to go to that church. So in 1802, when Pastor West resigned, and you remember that in 1800, he was still doing circuit riding on his horse between Acushnet and Fairhaven, and then you have to go all the way back to Acushnet because there's no bridge across the New Bedford Harbor, and then come down the other side and preach in New Bedford. I don't think he did them all three on the same Sunday. So he resigned. He was really elderly by then. And the church at the head of the river went into a decline, and finally the Methodists started using the meeting house. But in 1828, the three living members began holding worship services again. And they asked Sylvester Holmes, who was also a pastor down at the downtown Congregational Church at some point. He went up and led a Holy Communion worship service at the first service in 1828. So there were almost about 20 years where that church in the North End wasn't meeting. So whenever you start to say, what is the oldest church? This is an example. The Precinct Church was started first, but the Precinct Church had a little lull of about 20 years in which nobody was going. So the Unitarian Church in the center of the city, of course, didn't miss a meeting in those 20 years. So they feel that they are the longest continuing worship church in New Bedford, because the Congregationalists left and started their own church, and they're direct descendants from the church at the head of the river. But you all know what happened. The town of Acushnet moved. The town of Acushnet was at Lund's Corner. That's why it was called Acushnet Ave. So when the people restarted their church and then moved the church to Lund's Corner, they really weren't leaving Acushnet, because it was still because the town was way over, the boundary of the town was farther west than it is today. So they started a church, and they now also call themselves the First Congregational Churches of New Bedford, and consider themselves the oldest church. And they built the beautiful Lund's Corner Church, but that building is from 1868, and so I didn't think I haven't included pictures of the churches as they evolved over the years. We're just doing the very beginnings of the 1800s. So the North Congregational Church felt that they didn't have enough people. Didn't have enough seats for all the people. So they took down the beautiful wooden church. They took down this church. And that's why when you go downtown today, you can't find any trace of it. And put the stone church, much bigger stone church up above it. And that was about 1836. And inside, it did have vaulted arches. You see those arches up in the ceiling. The Unitarian Church has those too. And the Methodist Church up on County Street, because it acts like a seesaw or a counterweight, and it holds the sides in so that you don't have to have big buttresses on the outside to hold up those stone walls. There's no room for buttresses because it was on a street corner, you see. So located at the corner of Purchase and Elm, that's where the parking lot is today. And if you look across the street, there's a little building there, but that's where the first Christian church was put up. So those two churches were side by side. Then in 1836, the Unitarian Church left the meeting house that was over on the corner of Purchase and William, and the Quakers who had left the Quaker New Bedford meeting, and were very wealthy merchants by then, paid to put up the Unitarian Church. So the new congregational church called North Congo, and this first Unitarian Church, which is still there on the corner of County and Union, were both built in the same year. But because New Bedford was so wealthy, I don't think that they had any big debates over who should get some of the money for that first meeting house when the Congregationalists left. Now there was another new denomination in the country called Mormons. And in New York State in 1830, Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon. The book foretold that God would soon restore a truer, simpler church free of ministers. Every lay person was a minister, in other words. This was to take place not in the faraway Holy Land, but in North America. And Smith went on to start a religion based on the book he called it the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. And in time, people began calling members of the Church Mormon. Well, they didn't come here to New Bedford as far as we know, even though there is now a Mormon church that has been built since I moved here, that is in North Dartmouth, right on Cross Road. But I did find out that in Boston, in 1843, there were a rally with 1,200 people. And there were 14 small Mormon congregations that had been started since 1832. So in 1832, the first missionaries for the Mormon church arrived in Boston, but I don't have any records of them coming here. But another new denomination were called the Millennialists. Many evangelical ministers believed that America was leading the world into the millennium, on Earth's final 1,000 years of glory before the day of judgment. One Vermont farmer, William Miller, determined by studying the Bible that Jesus Christ would return to the world in 1843, and this return was called the Advent, or the Second Coming. Now you remember one of the principles of that newfangled Christian church, of which Hicksville and Smith Mills and First Christian Church New Bedford and all those other Christian churches that I showed you, was that you had the individual interpretation of the scriptures was the right and privileges of every person. So the big church downtown on Sunday nights would have a night in which you could come and speak. So if you had a topic that you felt that you had found in the Bible, something interesting that maybe you hadn't heard the pastor speak about, you could come, and downstairs, which would be we call Fellowship Hall, you could get up and speak on it, and everybody had to be very polite and very civil, so that they could ask you questions, but they couldn't disagree, they couldn't make fun of you, they couldn't laugh at you. And that was on every Sunday night. And we have records from Samuel Rodman, one of the richest of all of the Quaker whalemen. He's the one who invented spermaceti candles and owned the Rodman Candle Works. He used to go to those on Sunday nights. He'd start out by going to his own meeting, and then he'd go to his mother's for lunch. And then his brother, who was always protesting, so he was in jail for civil disobedience. He would go to see his brother at the Ash Street jail, and then by Sunday night, he'd go over and see these new talks at the Christian church. So when the Christians in New Bedford heard that there was a Vermont farmer, William Miller, who was saying interesting things by studying the Bible, that Jesus would come back in 1843, they said, let's get him down here. And they brought him down. He was from Vermont, but he also lived in New York, and he came down and he spoke a couple of times in New Bedford. This I should not have put in red. I should have put this in black, because this is not from the textbook. This is from what happened here. William Miller was invited to explain these views at the First Christian Church and then at the Washington Street Christian Church, Fairhaven. And after Miller visited, Joseph and Prudence Nye Bates believed in this so strongly that they and others of both churches left to become Adventists. So some people left the big First Christian Church, and some people left the Washington Street Christian Church. And they now added Adventists to the front of their name. So they no longer stuck with their principle that the name Christian would be the only sufficient name for a follower of Christ. They've now added Advent, and we still have groups of people, including the Advent camp meeting in Marion, where the name is Advent Christian. So then Joseph Bates believed that God had never intended Christians to change to worshiping on Sunday, and that Saturday, the seventh day, was still to be the Sabbath. And that's when he left Fairhaven in New Bedford, and they went to the Midwest. He and Ellen White and her husband, James White from Maine, they went to the Midwest, and with Mr. Kellogg, they started the Seventh-day Adventist religion. And remember, Kellogg was the one who invented breakfast cereals, because the Adventists, besides believing that Jesus is coming soon and that one should worship on Saturday, their other distinctive is that one should eat very, very, very healthy food. In fact, Seventh-day Adventists live longer than all the rest of us. They have a longer life expectancy if you take them out as a group. And so their beliefs, I think, about food seem to work out for them certainly very well. And I didn't get a picture in here that Job and Prudence Bates home in Fairhaven is now going to be an Adventist memorial site. And as of last summer, it was really wonderful, and it's going to have computers in there to, just like a regular museum. They've turned his house into a museum, and be able to study the history of Joe Bates and the history of the Adventists. But I didn't have a chance to put a picture in, and so that's going to have to be for a later time. Now, there's also in the textbook, it talked about women of the awakening and the roles that they played, and one of the Christian ministers, Moses Howe, who became the second chaplain of Seaman's Bethel, he felt that he had been brought to Christ through the preaching of a woman minister. So that was very early on, as we say, before 1830. But Mary Hicks was the wife of Elder Hicks at the First Church of Hicksville. And Elder Hicks used to say, "In my younger days, I used to travel considerably." Of course, he had to do that by horseback. "And as we had no children, Mary used to keep a horse and travel with me." And Mary was considered the aunt to the whole community of Hicksville. So there was a pastor's wife who had a wonderful standing in the community. And I hear there are a couple of lists of Quaker ministers at the time that were recorded ministers, and they, we know a name like Slade or like Gifford. We know some of those last names. Then the textbook goes on to talk about the churches started by persons of color. While the African Christian Society left the North Christian or the First Christian Church in 1826. And this was started in 1807. So in 1807, the Methodists started in the house at the head of the river. And in 1807, they started the North Congregational Church. And in 1807, they started the First Christian Church, which became the tall white church downtown. So that just shows that in the Second Great Awakening, the whole town was ablaze with the Holy Spirit in 1807. And at the time, at the Christian church, there were persons of color, and there weren't that many Cape Verdeans that lived in New Bedford at the time, but the ones that were there some of them were members at the First Christian Church. But in 1826, they decided to go up to the West End where a lot of them lived. And they had been walking down to North Christian and walking up the hill back to the West End. So they wanted to have a church up there that people could go to. and not have to walk all the way down the hill, but it was located where Kearney Academy now stands on Middle Street. And this is the map of the engineer of New Bedford, and the blue arrow was pointing right at the little square which was the African Christian Church. Now there must have been a good number of African people who were going to the first Christian church, because it says in the history book called History of the Churches of New Bedford that when in 1826, the persons of color that were members of the church left the church. It left a great hole in the membership, and they were sometime building up their membership again downtown in New Bedford. But I would love to have a plaque put inside of Kearney Academy, right in their back door, which would be exactly where the meeting house stood, because we have this really good map. But not only were there the African Christians, but well, this tells a little bit about it. Sally Antone was the Wampanoag from Dartmouth, who with her husband Joseph Antone, Cape Verdean, were members of the First Christian Church. And they were constituting members of the African Christian Church with John Christopher, Moses Shepherd, Ann Anderson, Charles Cook, Samuel Richards, Ruth Johnson, Diane Farmer, Rebecca Bailey, Margaret Shepherd, Catherine Dixon, Jane Fute, Avis Williams, Charlotte Cook, and Abby Christopher. And we recognize some of those last names in the city today. But there was another African church that was also growing in New Bedford that goes back to a Bible study that the persons of color started in the end of the Revolutionary War. It went on for some time before they actually started the church. And so I want to just show you pictures of the church basement now, which is right on County Street. A few years ago, they had a breakfast for the church women of the city. And this is some of us downstairs. These are all the women from Church Women United, and that went in answer to the invitation that day. And this is the African AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church stepped away from the Methodists in Philadelphia, because one time when the Methodist persons of color went up to pray at the altar, which Methodists do, the usher went and told them that they had to wait till the white people prayed first. And they were sufficiently upset about that they went and started their own denomination. And so it was no longer the Methodist Episcopal, but which is what the Methodist churches up here were called, Methodist Episcopal. It was the African Methodist Episcopal, and it's still called that today. So here's the pastor, and here I am. They gave me a little certificate for my years of ministry in the city. And next to me is Leona Fisher holding up the certificate because she was the one who worked so many years at the Interchurch Council, and she's also the pastor of the In the Name of Jesus Church right now on Chestnut Street. And with us is Ine O'Gagan, a young woman of the church whose mother, Berta Lynn Watson, is an assistant pastor there. And Ine has been part of Church Women United since she was in elementary school. And so she was the one who organized this breakfast. And why I'm showing you these pictures is just to give you a little hint, because you see that we're standing in front of this mural. And there's a beautiful mural down in the basement of Bethel Church that if you haven't seen, you would want to go. And you see up in the left-hand corner is Richard Allen, and he was the Methodist that led them when they left the church in Philadelphia. And there's his wife, Mother Sarah Allen. And up in the right-hand corner is the little building that they used first for their church. And we have three Quakers standing there. On the left is Gail Frost, and then Carolyn, and then Carol Cannon, who is the associate clerk, the co-clerk of the Dartmouth Monthly Meeting of Friends Today. So there were Quakers having their pictures taken in front of Richard and Mother Allen. So we started out by saying that we were going to talk about some of the new denominations that started in the early 1800s. And I said, but New Bedford was a little different because for one thing, we had all of these Quakers that were already here that were not mentioned in the Second Great Awakening, because at the time, the Quakers were not particularly having a great spiritual awakening among themselves. But we also have to answer the question, which someone asked me the last time we were together, which when did Roman Catholics come to the city? And the Roman Catholics, of course, mostly came from Europe, because the Episcopal denomination and the Lutheran denomination and the Roman Catholic denomination were long-time denomination churches in Europe. And so when they came here, they did not come to experience necessarily anything new that would that includes them in the Second Great Awakening. But nevertheless, because our city was growing so fast, and people from the whalers were many times stopping in Cape Verde and picking up people and bringing them home, sailors and bringing them home, there were Roman Catholics that started to come to the city. So in the early 1800s, they started a little tiny church on, as the Unitarian pastor put it, on the corner of Allen and the Dartmouth Road. I never know that Dartmouth Street was called the Dartmouth Road, and that's why it's called Dartmouth Street today. And there was a little tiny church. Now, can you see that arrow in the back, on the back side, coming down halfway down on the left? That little annex to this house, which is number 65 on Forest Street, that little annex back there is half of the original Catholic Church. That when they moved the Catholic Church and when they needed a bigger church and they bought a bigger church, which we'll talk about the next time we get together, they didn't need the old building. So the people that built this church on Forest Street apparently bought half of the Catholic Church and put it on the back. So I think this is like an extra bedroom for them. So I went down today to try to take a picture, but of course the plants have grown up. The next time I'll go and ask the people in the house if they would let me on their property to take a picture. But this is all I could take for you this morning. As you look down the side of the house and at the back, you see what is the shorter little bit of the annex. And that was what was the first Catholic church in New Bedford, but it wasn't there. Where it was, as the Unitarian pastor said, at the junction of Allen Street and the Dartmouth Road. And so that makes it right at Albertine Lopes Funeral Home. And Albertine Lopes was which is a funeral home today, which is the original site of the first Catholic church in New Bedford. And it was growing at the same time as these other churches that we've looked at today. And they had a cemetery there. And the first church was named St. Mary's Church. Now, you know, there's no St. Mary's Church in New Bedford today. There's St. Mary's North Fairhaven. Well, there's St. Mary's Church, Tarkin Hill, and there's St. Mary's in South Dartmouth. But this St. Mary's doesn't exist anymore, and we'll leave it for another time. And maybe you already know the story of why it's not named St. Mary's anymore. But this is a plaque that was put up in 1953 by the Knights of Columbus to commemorate that the first church was there before the congregation grew and they had to move to a bigger place. So the little building that was there is on the back of the house on Forest Street. But what happened to the people that were buried all around the church? Where are they now? Well, the church brought some land called out across the street from Shaw's. It wasn't Shaw's then, on the Smith Mills Road, and put in a cemetery called St. Mary's. And when they moved out of the little church here. They picked up everybody that was here and they reburied them at St. Mary's. And then they had bought all that huge land. So there are still people being buried at St. Mary's today, St. Mary's Cemetery. So even though there's no church called St. Mary's today, the original name for the first Catholic church is still existed in the wonderful cemetery that exists there on Route 6 that any of us can go in and visit at any time. So that is what is the Second Great Awakening is in the middle, and the parentheses on either side is how it started with the Quakers, and we got to the place where many Catholics were now moving into the city and they needed to have a worship place of their own.
Thank you, Pam. Wonderful story. Now we know much more than we did before the story started. And you got some great pictures. I'm not sure if we have the ability to have questions or not. Dan?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please unmute your microphone and you can ask. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, you should have a mic over to the left. You can unmute it and then ask your question.
And you can put on your video too. We can see you all.
Yes, we see some
Yeah.
people, not others.
Is that Elsie? Is Elsie here?
That's Elsie.
Oh, oh, she got a big smile.
Mary Lou's trying to
And
there she goes.
hi, Elsie.
Hello, how are you?
How you doing?
I'm doing fine, and so are you. It was wonderful, wonderful.
Well, Dan worked really hard to get me to get it to go. Oh, and there's Richard. Hi, Richard. We didn't talk about the American Indian churches that you had talked about in yours. The Paul Cuffey, of course, went to Westport to church, but in this early period of the 1800s, his family went to the Baptist church in Tiverton, maybe because they liked the music better, because Quakers at the time did not have music in the church.
His father-in-law was a Baptist minister at one of those Indian churches over on Horseneck Road in Dartmouth.
So I didn't realize his father-in-law came up here to be a minister. I thought he was an evangelist down the Cape. But
No,
he came up.
his name was Nehemiah Abel, and he lived about where Dartmoor Farm is now. And the church was on the east side of Horseneck Road, and that's why they found that Indian cemetery there. It was probably located very close to the church.
Thank you. Let's see. And John, how are you, John Duhan?
Very well. Very well.
It's so good of you to join.
Always interested. Always interested.
How did you like? Were you on? I couldn't see you on while I was showing my slides, but
Oh,
what did you?
I think I'm supposed to be right up close like everybody else, but I sit down, so you don't need to see me here. I'm just kind of in the woodwork,
Well, what did you think about me finding that reference to Polly Johnson being baptized? That was something new. I never knew that she had been baptized at the First Baptist Church.
Well, there's more going on in the record somewhere of the First Baptist Church that hasn't been publicized yet, but it's all there.
Right.
At some time it'll be available, and
Well, the first book is out on the web. The archive.org has put it out on the web.
Pam, I thought you might mention Robert's Rules of Order when you were talking about the Baptist church.
I didn't mention it because it didn't happen for another 30 years.
I would like to mention while I have the mic that on our website we have transcribed photocopy of the book by Peleg Burrows. What's the title of the book, Richard?
Peleg Burrows Journal.
Peleg Burrows Journal, which talks about the Baptist church, the first Baptist church over there in Tiverton that you showed us a picture of, and which had many people of color in the membership.
Right.
Burrows baptized Polly Johnson's mother, Hannah Sunks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Well, Polly Johnson I thought she was from Fall River. But
She
they were,
was. But Burrows got around quite a bit. I think her family lived not on the reservation, but near it. But Burrows rode around quite a bit, and he baptized them up in probably in Watuppa Pond.
Right. That Northwestport Christian Church that had Indian Native American membership, that's very near the reservation up there
oh, right.
in Watuppa. That's,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
What,
And it's also near the Sampson Potato Farm,
Yeah.
which was right next.
it's a private home now. You know, but in 1970, when I moved out, 71, when I moved here, they were merging one of the little congregational churches in Westport proper with the North Westport Christian Church.
Mhm.
And they had to, before they could sell the building, they had to find Indians to give some money to make up for the fact that they still owned pews.
Yeah.
They were the descendants still owned the pews. My grandfather, great-grandfather didn't own a pew, but he paid pew rents.
Yeah.
So I have like receipts, $2 a year, you know, that he paid for his pew.
The picture of the Christian church in Smith Mills with the pillars that you showed,
Uh-huh.
that building was moved up the street and is still existing. It's a residential home just up
On
up
Chase.
Road. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Well,
Old Westport and then it branches off to
whatever.
Chase, whichever.
It's been called both over the years. That's right.
Yeah.